Hello and welcome to this Unity Mono game hacking tutorial. Today I will show you how you can hack any Unity game compiled using Mono. For this we'll just need two things. Firstly, Dnspy, the tool we'll use to decompile and edit the game files, and of course a game made in Unity compiled using Mono. Firstly, check if you really have a Mono game. We'll start by going into the game directory. Do you have a folder ending in _data? If yes, it's at least a Unity game. If you see a file named gameassembly.dll though, the game is compiled in IO2CPP and this process is a lot harder. Maybe I'll do a future video on that. Now go into the folder ending in _data and search for a subfolder called managed. If this folder doesn't exist or doesn't contain a assembly C#.dll file, it's again an IO2CPP game. Open the assembly C# file in the Dnspy by dragging and dropping it into the program. Now by expanding the view, you can see all the different classes the game uses to work. I want my hack to be able to modify my player movement, so I went straight ahead into the player movement class, which fortunately has a static instance variable. Here you can see that the player has an extra jumps variable, so you might want to keep that in mind. Also, there's a rigid body variable, which also might be useful. I obviously want to be able to create items out of thin air, so I also looked at the way the game handles items. The item class is just a way to store the data, so all of the items are loaded into a dictionary when initializing. And lastly, we have a chatbox class handling all the messages in the chat, also including a static instance variable. To use all of this, we firstly have to create our own class to write our code in. You can code in Dnspy, but the compilation will mess your code up, so we'll use a different editor when writing. To make it work in a static context, we use a singleton class. You don't really have to understand why or how, but it just works by using a static instance of itself to have easy access from every other class. Now let's start writing. We use chat commands to control our hacks, so I firstly wrote a function onMessage. It just takes a chat message and splits it at every space. The first word is then set as the CMD variable and is then used by the switch statement. When it matches TP, it first checks if the message has an X, Y, and Z coordinate, so if it's long enough, and then sets the velocity to 0 on our player rigid body. Then we set the coordinate of the rigid body to our coordinates, and we're done. To now use the script inside our game, we just have to copy the code into the window we opened earlier and click compile. If you already created your class, you can edit it by searching for it, right-clicking, and choosing Edit Class. Now we just have to connect the chat box to our class. Fortunately, it's really easy to modify the send message function to hook into it. We'll do it similar to how the game already does this. We check if the first character is a tilde, and if it is, we call our onChat message using the global instance of our singleton class and give it the message as an argument. After that, we just return from the function to avoid sending it. If the Dnspy doesn't recognize your class, although you have written it, restarting the program might help. Now let's click on File, choose Save Module, and hit OK so the program compiles the modified game. Now let's run the game to test it. Here we are inside the game. Let's host the lobby real quick. And now let's test our command. TP000, and we have been TP'd somewhere in the lake under the map. Let's teleport ourselves up again. And it works. But of course we want to be able to do other things like, for example, giving ourselves weapons and other items. It first checks if the command is long enough, then if it's a valid item ID, if not it sends a chat message. And if yes, it gets the item with this ID from the item manager and adds it to our inventory using the inventory UI instance. Then it sends a success message and returns. Now let's copy the code into the Dnspy by right-clicking on our old class, hitting edit class and pasting it in, clicking save, and we successfully modified our hack line. Now let's click on file again and click save module, then hit OK, and let's test it again. Now we type in give and the item ID, for example 14, and we successfully gave ourselves a golden helmet. Now let's try 140. That's Grunk's sword. And let's try 141, which is this item. And lastly, I want to be able to fly. To be able to do that, I need to, of course, hook into the player movement class. After searching a bit, I found the movement function. As you can see, I just put an if statement at the top, checking if this function in my loader class returns true. If it does, so if this function handled our movement, it returns, so the in-game movement doesn't apply. If not, then we'll just revert back to the original game movement. This is so I can disable my fly hack when I don't want it to take effect. Now let's write the code. I started by defining a few variables like the acceleration, the multiplier, and so on. And also our rigid body of the player we used earlier and the player camera. We obtain those in the constructor of this class via the player movement instance and call the getRB function, and it just use the player camera. Also, we have a variable enable fly hack which we set to false in the beginning. Next, let's write the onMovement function. It checks if we press the right shift button. If we do, we enable or disable, so we invert the enable fly hack variable. And lastly, we use those 3 lines of code using this function to calculate our player movement. And again, now let's test it. Now let's press shift and we can fly.